Welcome to a deep dive. Today we are diving deep, really deep, into Jean-Paul Sartre's huge work, Being and Nothingness. It's known for being, well, a bit dense, challenging even, but you've given us this brilliant commentary to work with, which really helps us get a grip on it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic guide.
Think of it as our map, right? Because Being and Nothingness, let's call it B and N, it doesn't always lay things out straight. It zigs and zags.
Definitely. It jumps around a bit.
But this source material, it gives us clarity, helps us see the structure, the key ideas, and, why they actually matter.
Absolutely. The original text can feel a bit like a maze sometimes, jumping between different levels. Our source helps untangle that, helps us see the core argument. Sometimes it even rearranges Sartre's points a bit.
To foreground the big stuff.
Exactly. Things like freedom, consciousness, the nature of reality itself, it makes them stand out.
Okay, so our mission today: unpack the commentary, get a real handle on Sartre's major ideas, and figure out what he's really getting at. When he talks about time, the body, other people, desire, all these fundamental things.
And we'll see how he fits into the history of philosophy, too. He's wrestling with big questions from thinkers like Jacobi, Kierkegaard, about nihilism, subjectivity.
But making it his own thing.
Completely. Building on them, but forging something unique, systematic,
Yeah.
and fundamentally atheistic. That's key.
Right. Let's dive in. We've got a lot to get through here. Consciousness, freedom, the self, reality, how it all hangs together. Or maybe, doesn't quite. Okay, so the commentary kicks off by giving us some historical roots, placing Sartre in this philosophical conversation. It mentions Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi and his use of the term nihilism.
Yes, Jacobi used nihilism to critique philosophies like Spinoza's or Kant's. He felt they sort of annihilated the individual's reality and freedom, just dissolved the person into some larger system.
And that set an agenda.
It really did. Later thinkers, especially German idealists, had to respond to that challenge, try to counter that nihilism. The source highlights Kierkegaard here, too.
Because he focused on subjectivity.
Exactly. Like Jacobi, he put the individual experience front and center, rejected those big objective systems, especially for a more passionate religious inwardness, infinite activity within the individual.
But Sartre's different again, right? He takes up these themes. Subjectivity is crucial, but he builds a system, more like Fichte in that sense. And the source really stresses this. His atheism is unequivocally negative.
Absolutely. It's not just incidental. For Sartre, atheism is actually necessary for humanity to achieve its proper end.
So he's taking Kierkegaard's demand for subjectivity, echoing that Jacobi-Schelling priority of being, but framing it within a fully systematic and pointedly atheistic philosophy.
Precisely. It's a complex reaffirmation, but on his own terms.
The commentary also notes something interesting. Sartre didn't actually start with freedom as the main topic in his earliest works.
Right. Things on the self, emotion, imagination.
Yeah. But looking back at those helps us see how freedom became so central later in BNN. Those earlier works are shorter, maybe simplify some ideas that come back. Okay, let's get down to the bedrock. The absolute beginning of BNN, as the commentary lays it out, it talks about this fundamental opposition, two basic modes of being.
That's right. Sartre starts with being in itself and consciousness, which he calls being for itself.
Being in itself, what's that like?
Think of it as just, raw, solid, undifferentiated existence. The source calls it self-identical, opaque, beyond negation. It's not formless goo exactly, but the point is apprehending something purely as being in itself. It means seeing it as, well, it's not part of our human world of meaning. It's just there, unconditionally indifferent to us.
Just is. And consciousness, the for itself, is the total opposite. The source uses the word nothingness. That sounds pretty extreme.
It is extreme, but it's absolutely central to his whole system. Consciousness is nothingness, meaning it's empty, transparent to itself, and defined by this constant act of negation.
Negation.
Yes. Sartre argues consciousness first constitutes itself by being not the thing it's aware of. It's like this reflexive, flick-away consciousness looks at a chair and implicitly says of itself, I am not that chair. That's its primary act.
Huh. The source adds a little caution here, though. It says this means consciousness sort of makes itself exist through this act, but it's not a self-cause like God would be.
Right. It's self-activated by this negation, but it lacks that unconditional existential self-sufficiency. It doesn't ground itself completely. It needs the in itself to negate.
Okay, so we have this. opaque, solid in itself, and this empty, negating for itself consciousness. How on earth do we get from that stark split to the world we actually experience? Tables, chairs, other people, distinct things.
Good question. The commentary explains that we need to add more layers, more ontological structures. The differentiated world isn't just perceived by raw consciousness acting alone.
It comes through the structures of the for itself.
Exactly. The world emerges via the for itself. The source pulls quotes from Sartre like, a world, that is, the upsurge of a for itself, and even knowledge is the world. The world is a correlate of the for itself.
So consciousness denying that it is being, that somehow makes the world appear.
That's the idea. By negating the in itself, by standing apart, the for itself structures that being into a world for us. The nothingness of consciousness has to be routed through these immediate structures for objects to show up as distinct objects with meaning.
Now, you mentioned Sartre's early work on the self. How does that fit with consciousness being nothingness? Because the source says he really attacks our usual idea of a solid me inside.
He does. He wants what the commentary calls an atheism of consciousness. He's trying to dismantle that intuitive feeling we have of some substantial I underpinning our thoughts and feelings.
He says the self, our personality, is an effect, not the cause.
Precisely. It's something produced by consciousness, not its foundation.
But wait, when I reflect on my own thoughts, it really feels like they belong to the same me that's doing the reflecting. The source mentions Sartre maybe missed this at first.
Yeah, the commentary points that out. In Being and Nothingness, he adjusts. While reflection is explicitly about the thought you're reflecting on, it also implicitly grasps that both the reflecting and the reflected belong to the same subjective stream, a sort of partial self-awareness.
And there are different kinds of reflection, like impure reflection.
Yes, impure or accessory reflection. This is where we kind of objectify our own consciousness, treat it like an external thing. And this is where the psyche comes from, according to the source.
The psyche, like our personality.
Sort of. It's the unified self we construct, the one with stable traits, qualities, history, like a substance with properties. It's what Sartre called the ego in his earlier book, The Transcendence of the Ego.
Ah, okay. So it's the self that seems consistent over time, the one psychology might study, the one other people see.
Exactly. And it's the self where it makes sense to say, I have a pain in my stomach, locating a mental state within the objective body.
So our common sense feeling of having a stable core personality, that's actually a result of this impure reflection, turning our dynamic consciousness into a kind of fixed object.
That's the argument, yeah. Sort of self-objectification.
Okay, if the self isn't this fixed thing but an effect, how does that link up with freedom? Because the source notes, doesn't that impersonal view of consciousness maybe undermine our sense of being authors of our actions? Could almost sound like Spinoza?
That's exactly the challenge Sartre embraces. The commentary makes clear he doesn't try to define human identity first and then see if freedom fits. He flips it.
He doesn't see freedom as needing some special exemption from causality.
Not at all. For Sartre, freedom is primary. It's fundamental. It's implied in every single act of consciousness, every moment of awareness.
Every single one.
That's the claim. The source says his goal is to show that understanding human existence means seeing our mode of being is radically different from objects. And a proper understanding of freedom shows us that freedom is what defines this non-object mode of being.
And he links this freedom to what makes me, and you.
Yeah.
You, our individuation.
Yes. And the source adds a crucial point. Freedom, for Sartre, has no essence. You can't pin it down and define it like a thing. Trying to do that leads you in circles.
So how do we grasp it?
Pre-reflectively. Not by thinking about it, but just in the living of it.
Yeah.
As a pure factual necessity. It's simply how we are.
Okay. And he distinguishes this fundamental ontological freedom
from realized freedom.
Right.
Ontological freedom is the basic condition of being conscious, being for itself. Realized freedom is what we usually talk about, being free to do things, gaining or losing freedom in a social or political sense. That's more ethics and politics, which BNN doesn't fully delve into.
So social structures can limit my realized freedom, but not my fundamental ontological freedom.
Exactly. That ontological freedom is untouchable. It just is.
Let's circle back to negation again. It seems way more important for Sartre than just, saying that's not a cat. The source talks about its ubiquity and ineliminability. It's everywhere.
Absolutely everywhere. Negation isn't just logical, it's woven into all our practical activities. Asking a question involves a negation, seeking what is not yet known. Any project implies overcoming a current lack, a negation, failure, destruction, fragility. They all have this negative core.
And it's even deeper than that, a condition for knowing anything.
Yes, the commentary stresses this. It's a transcendental condition of cognition. To even perceive a world of distinct objects, consciousness needs negation.
How so?
Because every concept we use, every thought, uses negation to isolate and determine existence. To know what something is, you have to know what it is not. Truth itself brings in non-being. If X is true, then the world is thus and not otherwise, negating all other possibilities. Even the most basic awareness, what is present to me is what is not me. That non-being is built in.
Wow. Okay. And this leads to his idea of negatites, like Pierre not being in the cafe.
Exactly. Pierre's absence isn't just a thought in my head. It's a real feature of the cafe for my consciousness. It's a negatite, a state of affairs constituted by negation, an absence, a distance, a lack. These are objective facts within the experienced world.
And nothingness, le néant, is the overall status of this negativity.
Right. It's a real component of the real. And consciousness, through its power of annihilation, is what brings this nothingness into the world.
The commentary then introduces facticity. What's that about?
Facticity is, well, the source calls it what remains of the in itself in the for itself. It's the brute givenness of our situation. The fact that I am this consciousness here now with this past, this body.
It's about our contingency, the fact we didn't choose to exist.
Exactly. Combine that contingency not being our own foundation with the idea that the for itself is negated being in itself. Facticity means consciousness is always situated. It has a particularity it can't escape. My specific situation, like being a waiter, is the raw contingency of the in itself showing up at the level of the for itself.
This idea of not being our own foundation. It connects to lack, right? The source says lack is crucial for understanding possibility and desire.
Absolutely crucial. Because the for itself is this negation, this hole in being. It's fundamentally a lack of self-coincidence, of being fully solid like it in itself. And corresponding to this lack is an ideal.
The ideal of not lacking.
Yes, the for itself as self,
Right.
which is the impossible dream of combining the transparency of consciousness for itself with the solid self-identity of being in itself. And as the source points out, our common concept for something that is both perfectly self-aware and perfectly self-identical is God.
So because we are lack, we project ourselves towards this impossible ideal of being God. And that projection makes the possible appear in the world.
Correct. Possibility arises from this internal gap between myself as lack and myself as this ideal of completion. Desire, then, is fundamentally rooted in this deep metaphysical lack.
Which leads us to that really big claim the source calls motivational monism, that all our motives trace back to one thing.
Yeah, it's pretty radical. The fundamental project of human reality, Sartre argues, is this project to be in itself for itself, to be God. He literally says the ideal is a consciousness which would be the foundation of its own being in itself by the pure consciousness which it would have of itself, and calls this ideal God.
Therefore, man fundamentally is the desire to be God.
That's the line. Now, the source is quick to clarify. This doesn't mean everyday motives aren't real. Thirst is real. Wanting promotion is real.
But they only become our motives because we fit them into this bigger picture.
Exactly. We reconstitute them within this overarching, often unconscious metaphysical project. The doing, having, being analysis shows this. Wanting to do things or have things often symbolically relates back to the desire to be something solid, complete, godlike. Owning things can feel like possessing a piece of that substantiality we lack.
Okay, what about other people? The source dives into intersubjectivity. Encountering another person isn't just noticing them, it's an ontological transformation. What does that mean?
It means the presence of the other, specifically their look, fundamentally changes my own being for myself. When someone looks at me, they perceive me as an object in their world.
They kind of solidify me.
In a way, yes. Their look imposes a nature on me, fixes me, makes me something definite for them. It's similar to how my own impure reflection creates the psyche, but this time there's an aspect of their consciousness of me that's totally inaccessible to me. I become spatialized, temporalized by them, inserted into their universal time.
I become an object in their world, and my being is written in and by the other's freedom.
That's the phrasing. My body, too, becomes primarily an object for them.
So the other turns me into an object. That sounds bad.
Well, it's complex. The encounter also reinforces my own subjectivity by differentiating me from them. I am I, not you. But For that to happen, the other must also be a subject who resists being objectified by me.
Which creates this self-destructive conflict, a circle, the source calls it.
Right. Not a Hegelian dialectic where there's progress,
Mm.
just this constant oscillation. I try to make the other an object to assert my freedom. Then I experience being made an object by their look, which threatens my freedom. Back and forth.
Doesn't sound great for relationships. The source suggests harmonious partnership seems metaphysically unrealizable.
It does paint a pretty bleak picture of intersubjectivity at its core. Alienation seems built in. The commentary does float the idea of an equilibrium, maybe balancing seeing the other as subject and object, but suggests it's not a true synthesis, and may be impossible to escape if you're driven by that fundamental desire to be God.
You mentioned anguish earlier, that feeling of our radical freedom. The source says we often engage in a flight from anguish. Is that where bad faith comes in?
Exactly. Because facing that total freedom, that total responsibility, can be terrifying. So we flee. Bad faith is Sartre's term for this flight. It's an attempt by consciousness to pretend it's not radically free.
How does it do that?
Often by trying to view itself as a thing, as determined. By asserting psychological determinism or clinging to the idea of a fixed true self un moi profond that dictates its actions. I couldn't help it. That's just who I am.
So bad faith is basically pretending we don't have the freedom we actually have, lying to ourselves.
Yes, but it's more complex than just lying. Sartre's examples, the waiter, who's too much a waiter, playing the role as if it defines his being, or the champion of sincerity who claims they must be brutally honest because that's their nature, involves seeing human subjectivity in thing like in itself terms.
Trying to be solid, determined.
Right. It's a pre-reflective choice to act as if one were determined. But here's the twist. Because consciousness is fundamentally self-aware, pre-reflectively, it knows, on some level, that it's pretending. So Sartre argues bad faith doesn't actually escape responsibility.
So it's his way of explaining irrationality without resorting to something like Freud's unconscious, keeping the self unified and responsible. And the source calls it the first way freedom sort of fails itself.
And just before we wrap the main points, the commentary touches on value again. It's important to note, Sartre isn't a simple subjectivist saying anything goes. No. Value for him is a transcendent object, but it's rooted in that impossible project of being in itself, trying to found itself, the project that gives rise to the for itself. It's a weird kind of Kantianized Platonism, the source calls it. Values exist objectively for us, tied to this fundamental lack and striving.
And there's this idea of radical conversion or authenticity, a way out.
It's mentioned, yes, though apparently underdeveloped in Being and itself. It's linked to sustained, pure reflection. A moment, potentially extraordinary and marvelous, of making another choice of myself and my ends.
Choosing not to pursue the impossible desire to be God.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Overcoming that useless passion, as he calls it, and gaining a genuine ethical orientation, it hints at a different way of living with our freedom.
Now, the commentary, quite rightly, doesn't shy away from the criticisms Sartre faced.
No, it covers some significant ones. Gabriel Marcel, for example. He critiqued Sartre's focus on experiences like nausea, felt Sartre maybe ignored other experiences, maybe those pointing to Christian existentialism.
Marcel also saw BNN as incoherent, a mix of things.
Yeah, with a sort of hidden materialism underneath, and ultimately accused Sartre of axiological nihilism, basically, that his view on value leads nowhere, makes everything meaningless. Again, this is Marcel's view, as reported in the source.
Merleau-Ponty gets a mention, too.
Right. He argued Sartre's really strict dualism, that sharp split between in itself and for itself, actually undermines Sartre's own goals, makes it hard to explain freedom or how we connect with others. Merleau-Ponty suggested starting differently, maybe with just one mode of being.
Though the source notes that might lose the guarantee of freedom Sartre wanted.
It's a trade-off, perhaps. And then, of course, there were Marxist critiques.
Predictably, yeah.
Calling Sartre's view idealism, too focused on the lone individual, ignoring social and historical forces, unable to explain collective action. These are all important challenges raised against Sartre's system, presented here for context.
And finally, the commentary loops back to that really tricky question of origins. And God again, Sartre's line, quote, "Everything takes place as if the in itself gave itself the modification of the for itself." What's with that as if?
It's crucial. The source explains that the actual origin is a profound contradiction for Sartre, because the in itself is non-conscious, inert. How could it initiate anything? Ontology, for Sartre, just describes the result. We have these two modes of being in relation.
But metaphysics tries to ask why.
Right. But trying to ask why or how consciousness emerged from the in itself leads to contradictions within Sartre's own framework, like the idea of a total self-caused being enso causa sui, God which would unify the in itself and for itself. But that concept would make the in itself dependent on the for itself, which flips Sartre's starting point on its head.
So the very idea of God, understood as that self-caused totality, is contradictory within his system, which makes his atheism necessary for coherence.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Yeah.
The source suggests this problem of origin really pushes Sartre to separate ontology, describing what is, from metaphysics, explaining origins, and shows the limits, maybe futility, of metaphysics. His whole bind comes from insisting the in itself is non-conscious while needing the for itself to somehow arise. Maybe, the source muses, you'd need some aperspectival absolute standpoint to make sense of it.
Okay. Wow, let's try to pull some threads together. We have journeyed through some seriously challenging, but I think really compelling territory in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, thanks to this commentary.
It's a huge landscape.
We've seen him put human freedom right at the absolute center, not just important, but constitutive of who we are, rooted in consciousness as this nothingness, defined by negation, by lack, and in this weird, tense relationship with the solid being in itself.
Yeah, and we explored how our sense of self isn't fixed, but tied up with reflection, and especially with the look of the other, which creates this fundamentally, well, problematic intersubjectivity. Conflict seems almost built in.
And we hit that massive idea that our deepest underlying drive, according to Sartre, is this impossible quest, the desire to be God, that perfect, unreachable fusion of freedom and solid being.
Which leads to bad faith. Our attempts to run away from the anguish of knowing we are free by pretending we're determined, like things.
But there's that glimmer maybe of authenticity, a way to choose differently perhaps, to live with the freedom, not flee it, maybe even overcome that useless passion.
It's hinted at. So this whole deep dive, looking at the commentary, it reveals this incredibly systematic challenge to just about every common sense idea we have about ourselves. Freedom, reality. Our existence, defined by freedom and lack, is just radically different from the world of objects and deeply entangled with itself and others in these complex, often contradictory ways.
So, after all that, what does this mean for you, listening? We've covered a massive amount historical context, the nuts and bolts of consciousness, desire the other. It leaves us with this powerful, maybe unsettling challenge to our assumptions.
Absolutely. Think about it. If our fundamental project is impossible, if that desire to be God can't be fulfilled, and yet we remain radically free, totally responsible for everything we are, everything we choose, even for the meaning our world has.
Yeah.
What does that really imply?
About the choices you make every single day.
Yeah, about how you relate to others, knowing that inherent tension, about how you understand your own being, living as this lack that is also pure freedom. What really stands out to you from diving into Sartre's world? What resonates or what pushes back?